Hey there, so I got another video for you. Today this is going to be a deck guide on a space-based red Han list. This is a pretty cool deck. It's a fun one. This is not like one of your typically hyper-competitive decks. It's just a really unique little build that I want to share with you. And so I'm going to get right into it. Here's the list. The link to this is going to be down in the comments. We're going to go, as I typically do, through all the cards in here and kind of what I'm trying to do with this build, some pros, some weaknesses, and everything kind of in between. You'll do note that I am playing the 30 health red base here, not Tarkin Town. That's debatable. I'm still kind of debating it. I think since we're mostly not engaging in much unit combat with this deck, because kind of the goal here is to avoid it entirely. Tarkin Town may not even have targets in a lot of games, but it still might bail you out in some very specific situations, so it's still a consideration. Alright, so what is the theory behind this deck? First of all, this is for fun. This is like a almost entirely space-based deck. We're kind of avoiding an entire arena to leverage the power of outmaneuver in this deck as kind of a complete turn damage negation tool, right? We'll spend 3 to kind of exhaust the entire ground arena so that we can continue pushing damage. We play some weird cards because of this. There's not a huge card pool in general right now, so it's kind of hard to fill your deck with really powerful space units. Although there are some, notably like Millennium Falcon. Han in general lets us play ahead of curve, which means our typically weaker space units come out a little earlier so they can keep pace with the ground arena. Additionally, Black 1 in a Han deck is incredibly powerful because he tends to dump his hand real fast with his ability. If you have a Black 1 in your hand, you can even more aggressively use Han's ability with the pure intention of just refueling on your Han turn. Another thing I think is, as we get more cards, this is another deck that might benefit a lot right now. It's kind of on the weaker side, quite frankly, because we're playing a lot of weak units in it. To avoid the ground arena entirely, we can't play a lot of our more powerful tools right now. We try to capitalize on that with something like outmaneuver, which is very strong when we're doing this, but we still end up with kind of underpowered units a lot of the time. And I think maybe in the future, this kind of strategy will actually become very competitive. And I know I usually focus on more competitive builds or decks that I could recommend taking to a tournament. This is in fact not one of them. This is more for fun. I think this is like an interesting thing. It'll catch a lot of people off guard. It has like a really good matchup into Sabine aggro. So I think if that's something you want to kind of beat with a really weird deck, this will be a cool choice, right? You will race them almost every single time. They won't see it coming. They'll think they're going to beat you one turn because they have like 15 damage on the ground ready to hit you, and you'll outmaneuver them and kill them that exact same turn. It's cool to do something like that. Not a lot of people will see it coming. Alright, so the space. Alright, the main deck is focusing on space, right? There's 22 space units here. Not all of them are that powerful. Green Squadron A-Rings, great. We play that in basically any red hero deck. Pirate Starfighter in this deck is pretty good. It's kind of like our Millennium Falcon at home. The goal is we have a lot of one-drop ground units in part to turn this guy on so that we can play him on turn 1, right? Play a ground 1-drop, use Han's ability, bounce that 1-drop back to our hand. So we've got our 2-4, kind of 3-4 attacking space unit on turn 1, which is what Millennium Falcon is, except Millennium Falcon is way better. The other neat thing about the Starfighters, we do have some like utility cards that we can bounce back, so sometimes you get some value there. And I think it's nice to have 4 health space units because it like the biggest weakness for space units and tend to be things like Consortium Star Viper, the 3/3 that heals 2 if they have initiative, or something like 7th Fleet Defender, the 3/2 with a shield. Those cards are real bummers for some space units, but 4 health kind of gets around that. Red 3 in this deck, man, it's not very good. We don't have that many heroic cards in this deck. It's mostly just a 3/3 space unit, which, okay, we'll do it. Disabling Fangfighter is another one that's like usually something I prefer out of the sideboard. It's not terrible out of a main deck. As kind of a core to our strategy, it's like silly, right? We're playing it as basically just a 3/2 because we want 3 powered space units. You'll get some value out of the Upgrade Destroy sometimes. It has no synergy with anything else, but we run a couple. Millennium Falcon, obviously very good. Don't need to talk too much about that. The Liberator Gunship is an important card to kind of give us some interaction in space in case there's something that absolutely needs to get out of our way. It does ambush as a 4 power unit if you have a red 3 in play, which is nice. Past that, it's another 3/4 in space, which is what Strafing Gunship is as well. We very rarely will use that to attack into the ground arena. So again, it's just here because it's a 4 health, 3 power space unit. And then Black One, which I talked about, is a good card in Han. It's a refuel tool. It's got synergy with a few other things we'll talk about. But this one is something I think even in a regular Red Han deck will be one of the more powerful ability cards. I think it's something. I think a card's a little slept on in general. I think in Red Han it is a huge power swing and should be getting some more love. All right, the ground. All right, most of this is not really to like engage in that much of ground warfare. Greedo he's a 3 power 1-drop. There is just a lack of enough good early space units that he's good enough. If he can get in for 3 damage, that's great. Him along with Spec Force Soldier and Leia both turn on a turn 1 pirated starship. Leia because she can ready one of your resources, and the other 2 simply because they cost 1. Leia and Spec Force are also kind of utility, right? So you can, on a turn later in the game, that if they have a Bright Hope in play or System Patrol Craft, you can Spec Force it. You get in your damage, and they're not going to really worry too much about that Spec Force. You might be able to bounce it back to your hand with your starship so that you can replay it the next turn to get rid of that Sentinel again. Leia, similarly, you can use it to exhaust something, right? So if they're engaging in some kind of ground race with you, you can Leia, exhaust it, return her to your hand with the pirated starship, and rinse and repeat. Wolf, also, he does not enable the starship on turn 1, but he has some applications there as well. He is a 3 power early play, which is nice. You could do the same thing with like Sabine Wren. I just don't really have any rebel synergy for her, so I pick him because he also has the ability to negate like healing for a turn, which is sometimes relevant. K2 on the other hand is really strong. I mean, we're an aggro deck. We kind of have to run K2. We're also playing Sneak Attack, which is good with K2, and we're playing Heroic Sacrifice, which is good with K2. So he's just kind of there because strong. The events are actually good, okay? I think this deck has a plethora of events to choose from. There's some more I'll list later in the video, but the events are good, and they're definitely not the weaker part of this deck. Heroic Sacrifice is a great aggro tool. It'll be good with like the K2, but it'll also be good with like our dinky 1-drops if we just want to push damage and cycle them. If we have wounded units that are going to die, it's good. Or if you have like 2 Millennium Falcons, 1 in our hand, 1 in play, we can blow one up, play the next one. It's nice. Spark of Rebellion is a main interaction tool. Since the goal here is to kind of avoid interaction in general, but there are some cards that will completely blow us out. Overwhelming Barrage is one of them. If we can snag that, it's great, right? Because space units tend to be a little weaker than ground units. Then like a barrage is even more devastating for a deck like this. Also, if there's certain like point removal that they have that they're ready to use on one of our more important units, if we're like in a racing situation and they have a good ground unit that's gonna tilt that race. Spark is kind of our catch-all. It's going to be important in a deck like this. It's why there's 3 copies. Sneak Attack, on the other hand, is fun. This is a aggressive deck, and there's a few good targets for it. K2 probably being the best, but also black 1 to turn early. If you've dumped your hand real quick with Han, just getting this out for 5 resources, being able to push 4 damage and draw 3 immediately. Additionally, if you don't like those 3 cards, the black 1 will die. You'll be able to cycle them. It's also interesting with the Pirated Starship, and I mentioned that card a lot in this deck. I think there's just a lot of decent synergy with it, but you can do a sneak attack on a cheap unit. For instance, let's say even a 3, like a red 3 or something, right? It's not a particularly scary thing. You'll get in your 3 damage most likely, and might even buff something else. You've only spent 2 resources. You can immediately, like if you have 4 resources, right after that you can play your Pirated Starship, return that red 3 to your hand. It won't die now because of the sneak attack's ability. You get some more value there. Surprise Strike is like one of the most powerful aggro tools we have. Just pushes a lot of damage. We run 3. Outmaneuver we talked about. It's kind of the focus here is to be able to race with ground-based decks, which typically space-based decks can't do. So we run that. And Cunning. Cunning has been surprisingly good at 6 in this deck. I think the fact that Han is pretty vulnerable in this deck, especially because we don't have any ground support, being able to like exhaust a couple things or bounce something before Han comes out so that he can get his damage in is nice. Additionally, because we don't have a lot of things interacting with us, getting that +4 in space on one of your units will be pretty big. They're less likely to get blown out because your opponent might just have a bunch of ground units. They can't attack your space units with it. So a bounce and a +4 might be just what we need. Another consideration in this slot was Change of Heart, which I think also fights pretty well here. I opted with Cunning, but I think that's a swap that can be made. Sideboard, I mean, there's a lot you can do here. I picked a few cards that I think is kind of where I'd start with this, but because this deck is kind of a work in progress, it's a fun experiment. There's nothing I'm married to here. Mostly it's stuff to help us interact a little better. Usually if you're going to sideboard any of these cards in, you need to take some events out because the deck only has 35 units in it right now. Bamboozle is another racing tool, but it also will help you with decks that are going really tall. So for instance, you might not be able to race a turret deck, but Bamboozle will help you there, especially if they're playing a lot of upgrades. If there's someone playing Tarkin and just like hard buffing something on the ground, that can be a huge problem because Overwhelming Barrage will literally board wipe you, but Bamboozle can get rid of all that experience. It's just a nice little catch-all. We have black 1 to refill our hand, so I think Bamboozle's pretty strong. Open Fire, self-explanatory. Sometimes you just need to be able to get rid of something. Waylay, I think, is going to be important for decks that have a lot of restore, so decks that play like Yoda and Kanan. Since we don't have any way to actually get rid of those units, we might need to just delay that healing a little bit. And Forced Surrender is just a really good anti-control card. It's another decent card in Han because of the card draw, right? We'll be able to catch up a little bit, so that's why that's there. All right, we talked about most of this, but interactions, right? We got Pirate Starfighter who interacts well with Leia and Spec Force. We get him out on turn 1 with those cards. He also lets us reuse their abilities. He also interacts well with like Sneak Attack in that we can bounce with those things back to our hand. Sneak Attack's main targets are K2 and Black 1 in this deck. It's nice if you even have a Heroic Sacrifice in your hand to go with it to get even more value. But sometimes just sneaking in something that costs 3 to push some damage is nice. And I think those are the main synergies between these things. All right, other considerations. These are other things that you might want to play with. The cheap one cost upgrades like Snapshot and Infiltrator skill can help your slightly weaker space units build up in toughness. Specifically, they'll have more health. They'll be harder to bring down. Disarm is a card I think about sometimes as a way to kind of delay an Overwhelming Barrage for a turn, especially against like predictable play lines like Boba Fett, who will deploy and then barrage, right? If we can just disarm him, maybe that play kind of gets neutered real bad, and then we get a full turn of damage against them. It might be enough to swing it. Shoot first. You know, it's It's a good card. We're not usually looking for direct unit interaction, so it's why I haven't played with it that much. Asteroid Sanctuary, on the other hand, being able to shield things will be nice to prevent point removal from like open fire or damage from overwhelming barrage, or allow something to like live for one extra turn from a trade. So it seems like a decent consideration. And Change of Heart as well, I think, will be pretty strong in this deck, especially if we can pair it with Heroic Sacrifice. So that's another consideration. As for the units here, it's a small rebel package. I think overall I couldn't fit enough rebels into the deck to make like Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant make the cut, and because of that I just didn't end up playing Sabine and Alliance X-Wing. But I think if you maybe tweak a little more, or if you don't focus so much on a full space deck, these cards will naturally be much better. And Starwing Scout, I played with this a bunch, and I'm kind of sad to leave it out. There's a couple problems with it. Notably, in Han, you basically never have initiative because you're using his ability a lot, and this is a swarm-style deck. We're playing a lot of units and attacking a lot. It's very rare for us to have initiative. As such, it was basically just a 4-1 for 3, which is okay. I mean, barely anything in space deals 4 damage, so that's nice. But the 1 health made it even more of a liability against other decks' space units because it just died to anything, and then also just incidental damage from things like barrage. It ended up feeling a little too weak. But I was sad about that. All right, I'm not doing a deep dive on matchups. This is not a competitive meta deck. This is not meant to be that. It's meant to be a fun experiment and something to catch people off guard, maybe at your local for a week. I will note that I think it beats up on Sabine. I think they just don't interact with us very well at all. They're trying to race us, but they won't win that race. So that's why I've kind of mentioned that here. Boba Fett also mostly interacts on the ground, but they get to play Overwhelming Barrage, which can be a big blowout. So Spark of Rebellion is very important. They also have things like 7 Fleet Defender and Consortium Star Viper, which can be problematic for some of our space units to deal with. It's a tough matchup, but you can spike a win there sometimes, and that feels great. And then like I put Iden here, but it's mostly just a placeholder for control decks. They'll be tough because we're kind of an all-in style deck. If their removal lines up early with like Power of the Dark Side and Takedown and Barrage, like it might be too much for us to actually push enough damage. But if we are able to flood a little bit the way a Sabine deck would and put them on the back foot and get to like our Han turn in decent shape where we can like Han push more damage in and then like Black 1 refill or play Force Surrender if we sideboarded that in, then you might be able to do okay there. All right, so if you made it here, thanks for watching. I hope you will subscribe to the channel, like this video. If you have any questions about this build, any tweaks you might make, I'd be happy to hear it. Again, this one's for fun. It's not my typical bread and butter. It's not usually what I do the videos on, but this one I just I wanted to get out there. I also thought I had a pretty cool thumbnail for it, so maybe that was a little motivation too. I think most of the expensive cards in here will fit really well in a more typical Red Han deck and might be staples to come, like Millennium Falcon and Black 1 and K2SO. So if you have those and you just want to like play 1 week, you like come in, they think you're playing a regular Han Red aggro deck, and you bust this out and they have no idea what's happening, I think that could be fun. And you'll have the pieces for a pretty good deck otherwise, right? I think Red Han's actually a pretty good deck when played in its more like traditional configuration with higher ground focus. All right, so that's a wrap. Thanks for coming down here and watching, and take care.